The year was 1938, and the humid air of the Mississippi Delta was thick with the scent of stagnant water and impending violence. Under the cover of a moonless sky, nearly 100 members of the local clan moved with practiced silence, forming a ring of hatred around a sprawling, black-owned ranch. They came armed with Winchester rifles, coiled hemp ropes, and something far more dangerous, a written guarantee from the county sheriff that no law would interfere with the night's corrections. Their target was Elijah Mercer, a man the town mocked as Big Eli. To the white merchants in town, he was merely a slow-moving, limping landowner, a man they believed was too physically broken to run and too spiritually defeated to resist. As they tightened their circle, they began to count their numbers aloud, their voices carrying through the cypress trees like a funeral dirge. They argued over who would have the honor of striking the first match at dawn, their laughter echoing with the certainty that greed had already secured their victory. But by the first light of the following day, the county would face a reality they were not prepared for. Many of those who rode in that night would never return, others would vanish into the swamp, and those who survived swore they had been under fire from their own shadows. Before we uncover the truth behind that night, let us know where in the world you are watching from, and be sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is a journey you cannot afford to miss. The dying embers of the afternoon sun cast long, skeletal shadows across Elijah Mercer's sprawling cotton fields. It was a landscape of gold and green, but for Eli, it was a tactical map he had spent 15 years memorizing. His massive 300-pound frame moved with a calculated, agonizing slowness as he collected his tools. Every motion was an exercise in theater. He exaggerated the hitch in his right hip, forcing a pronounced limp that made him appear fragile despite his 6'4" height. In the town of Greenville, he was the harmless giant, a man who kept his shoulders hunched to hide his breadth and his eyes fixed on the dirt to hide the sharp military intelligence burning within them. He spoke in a soft, stuttering drawl that invited pity, playing into every stereotype the local power structure demanded. They saw what they needed to see. An aging laborer who had somehow stumbled into land ownership, a man too simple to be a threat and too pitiful to be feared. As he secured the heavy timber doors of his barn, the air hung heavy with the oppressive heat of late August. His ranch was an island of 20 acres of the richest silt in the delta, bordered by dense cypress groves and the oppressive silence of isolation. He had chosen this location with a soldier's eye, knowing that in the deep south, isolation was a double-edged sword that cut both ways. As the crickets began their rhythmic evening chorus, Eli moved toward the henhouse with his usual rhythmic shuffle. His large, calloused hands, which could snap a neck with the same ease they used to cradle an egg, carefully placed the evening's yield into a wicker basket. The world was still, routine, and seemingly safe, until the first spark of orange light pierced the tree line. It looked like the eye of a demon opening in the dark. Then came another and another, until the entire southern border of his property was a shimmering wall of fire. These were not random travelers. These were men who believed they held a divine mandate over the night. Figures in white robes emerged from the gloom, their torches casting a hellish glow on the cotton plants. Eli stood tall for a fleeting second before catching himself and slumping back into his Big Eli persona. He counted the torches with the speed of a veteran officer. At least 100 men, many of them clutching rifles that gleamed with cold, metallic intent. The sight of the hoods did not shock him. He had been preparing for this inevitable confrontation since the day the deed to this land was signed. The voice of Sheriff Halverson eventually cut through the stillness, his tone as casual as if he were addressing a town hall meeting, demanding that Mercer step toward the porch for business. The glint of a silver badge pinned to a white robe was the only validation Eli needed. Beside the sheriff stood Reverend Matthews, a man of the cloth who felt so secure in his righteousness that he hadn't even bothered to lower his hood. The law and the church stood hand in hand, a unified front of white supremacy designed to crush any hope of resistance. "Your time is up, boy," a voice spat from the darkness, thick with the arrogance of a man who believed the outcome was already decided. "You should have stayed in your place." Eli retreated toward his porch with a dramatic display of clumsiness, his hands visibly shaking as he reached for the railing. To the mob, he looked like a cornered animal, a broken man ready to beg for his life. They fed on his apparent terror, their laughter rippling through the ranks as they drew closer. The sound of multiple rifles being cocked echoed across the yard, a sound Eli knew intimately, a sound that in any other context would have triggered a different version of the man. "Turn around, Mercer," Halverson barked. "Look at the men who own this county." Eli turned, his massive frame filling the doorway, sweat glistening on his dark skin in the firelight. He raised his hands high, fingers spread wide to show they were empty, his head bowed in a posture of complete and total submission. "Please, sirs," Eli's voice wavered, just enough to convince them he was on the verge of collapse. "I don't want no trouble, I just want to live." The mockery from the crowd was instantaneous. This was the big Eli they knew, the simpleton who shuffled and apologized for his own shadow. They saw a man too dull to be dangerous and too cowardly to fight, never realizing that his raised hands were not just a sign of surrender, but a way to gauge the wind and the positioning of his enemies. Sheriff Halverson stepped forward, the torchlight dancing in his eyes. "This land is too good for you, Mercer. It's time to set the natural order right." Eli seemed to shrink even further, his voice a pathetic whisper that barely reached the front line. "I got the papers, paid fair and square." A deputy named Earl Denton pushed to the front, his hand resting eagerly on his holster. "Papers don't mean a thing tonight. Only thing that matters is what's right, and you owning this dirt, ain't it?" With a desperate rush tone, Eli made his final plea. He offered to sign it all away. The house, the cattle, the 20 acres of prime Delta soil, if they would only let him flee north and never return. A sudden silence fell over the mob. The bloodlust was momentarily stalled by the intoxicating scent of easy profit. 20 acres of the richest land in Mississippi, signed over legally and without a struggle, was a prize even more valuable than a hanging. As the torches receded into the tree line, leaving only the acrid scent of kerosene and the fading echoes of cruel laughter in their wake, Elijah Mercer retreated into his home. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut and the iron bolt slid home, the performance of Big Eli ended. The trembling in his hands vanished instantly, replaced by a stillness that was both cold and absolute. The hunched, apologetic shoulders straightened, revealing the true, broad-shouldered silhouette of a man who had survived the harrowing mud of the Argonne forest. He did not light a lamp. He moved through the darkness with a predator's grace, navigating the familiar layout of his living room by memory alone. Underneath a heavy rug near his bed, a secret lived. 3 loose floorboards that had remained undisturbed for 15 years. With the precision of a watchmaker, Eli pried them up to reveal a hidden cavity lined with oiled canvas. Inside lay the ghosts of a life he had tried to leave behind. He withdrew a Springfield M1903 bolt-action rifle, its walnut stock scarred by history, but its barrel gleaming with meticulous care. Beside it sat 3 Colt M1911 semi-automatic pistols and several boxes of ammunition carefully wrapped in wax paper. As he ran a cloth over the Springfield's bolt, the simpleton who shuffled through town was gone. In his place stood a master of long-range ballistics, a man who had once been the primary marksman instructor for an entire division, now preparing to deliver his final, most difficult lesson. The official records of the Great War had tried to erase his contributions, but Elijah's memory was an indelible ledger. 2 decades ago at Camp Shelby, he had stood before rows of white recruits, teaching them how to hold their breath at the natural respiratory pause, and how to squeeze a trigger so as not to disturb the sight picture. He had been a phantom in the French trenches, a man whose name was whispered by the enemy and suppressed by his own high command. The army had used his eyes and his steady hands to win impossible battles, then sent him back to a world that demanded he forget his own worth and dignity. Some of the very men currently hiding behind white hoods in his tree line had once been his pupils. He recognized their voices, their distinct gaits, and their fundamental flaws as marksmen. He knew Deputy Denton always pulled his shots to the left under pressure, and he knew Sheriff Halverson lacked the stomach for a sustained, symmetrical fight. They had spent years mocking his size and his limp, never realizing that his extra weight was a carefully maintained camouflage designed to put them at ease. In the South, a black man who looked strong was viewed as a target. A black man who looked pitiful was overlooked. Eli had weaponized their prejudice, using their own arrogance to hide the fact that he was the deadliest individual within 500 miles. He began loading magazines with a methodical, rhythmic click, each metallic snap a countdown to the dawn, that the clan believed they already owned. A rhythmic, urgent tapping at the back door interrupted the silence. Eli moved to the entrance with a pistol already drawn, his footsteps making no sound on the floorboards. It was Caleb Johnson, a local youth who looked up to Eli with a mixture of awe and confusion. The boy was breathless, his eyes wide with the realization of the night's true stakes. "Mr. Eli, they're lying," Caleb hissed, his voice cracking with adrenaline. "I was hiding near the creek and heard Denton talking. They aren't waiting for no papers at dawn. They're coming back in an hour to burn you out while you're trapped inside. They said they want the land, but they want to make an example of you more." Eli nodded slowly, the information confirming his tactical assessment of their character. He didn't show fear. Instead, he exhibited a cold, clinical focus. He reached into his pocket and handed the boy a small roll of bills, his voice dropping into a low, resonant tone that Caleb had never heard before. The voice of a commanding officer in the field. "You shouldn't be here, son. Go home, take the back trails through the swamp, and tell your mother to stay inside with the lights doused. No matter what you hear tonight, you keep your head down and your mouth shut. Tomorrow, the world is going to look different, but you need to be alive to see it." Caleb stared at the weapons on the bed, the reality of the situation sinking in. He saw the big Eli mask fall away completely, revealing the lethal professional beneath. With a final solemn nod, the boy vanished back into the shadows. With Caleb gone, Eli began the physical preparation of the battlefield. He didn't just plan to defend the house, he planned to manage the psychology of the mob. He moved to the upstairs windows, calculating ranges to the fence line, the barn, and the various outcroppings where cover was most likely to be sought by an amateur force. He placed caches of ammunition at every corner of the house, ensuring he would never be more than 2 steps away from a reload. He loosened a few strategic shutters, creating narrow firing ports that offered maximum protection from return fire. Then, he stepped out into the tall grass of the inner perimeter. He didn't use explosives. He used logic. He strung nearly invisible tripwires at ankle height across the most obvious paths of approach. He moved a tractor just enough to create a fatal funnel that would force attackers into a concentrated, exposed area near the porch. Returning to the house, he donned his old military webbing, the leather worn smooth but still perfectly functional. He felt the weight of the Colt on his hip and the Springfield in his hands, and for the first time in 15 years, he felt a strange, quiet sense of peace. The clan believed they were hunting a frightened old man in a cabin. They had no idea they were walking into a fortified position held by a man who had mastered the art of the ghost shot. As the first hints of grey began to touch the eastern sky, Eli took his position. He took a long, slow breath, his pulse slowing to a steady, combat-ready rhythm. The pre-dawn silence of the delta was shattered not by a scream, but by the heavy, rhythmic crunch of boots on sun-baked earth. Nearly 60 men, the vanguard of the clan's enforcement squad, moved through the cotton rows with the clumsy arrogance of those who believed their numbers made them invisible. Eli watched them through a reinforced firing slit, his Springfield M1903 resting on a sandbag. Through the high-powered optics, he could see the nervous sweat glistening on their faces beneath the white hoods. These were not soldiers. They were local merchants and mechanics playing at war, bunching up in groups, a fatal tactical error. Sheriff Halverson was visible in the center, waving a nickel-plated revolver and barking orders that were far too loud for a stealth operation. Eli waited, his breathing deep and even, his heart rate settled at a steady 60 beats per minute. He allowed them to cross the invisible line he had mapped out days ago, right until the lead man's foot caught the tripwire buried in the silt. The sudden clatter of a falling rifle and a sharp, panicked curse acted as the starting gun. Eli squeezed the trigger, but he didn't aim for the man. Instead, he shattered the wooden fence post inches from Halverson's head. The night exploded into a chaotic symphony of undirected gunfire and terrified shouts as the mob realized their pitiful target had vanished, replaced by a ghost who struck from the shadows with terrifying precision. Confusion is the most potent weapon in the arsenal of a man who stands alone. Eli transitioned from the south window to the north with a fluid speed that defied his 300-pound frame. He never stayed in one position long enough for the attackers to fix his location. He would fire a single, well-aimed shot that kicked up dirt at an officer's feet or snuffed out a torch, then melt back into the darkness of the room, only to reappear 30 feet away. To the terrified men outside, It seemed as if an entire squad of professional snipers was defending the ranch. Every time they attempted to signal an advance, Eli's bullet would disrupt the rhythm, herding them like frightened cattle into the fatal funnels he had engineered. He watched through his sights as Deputy Denton tried to lead a flanking maneuver toward the barn. Eli didn't hit him. Instead, he sent a round into a metal tractor rim nearby. The resulting ricochet whined like a banshee through the air, sending Denton and his men scrambling backward into the mud. The psychological shift was instantaneous. The hunters were suddenly being hunted by a phantom who seemed to see through walls and move through solid shadow. Shouts of, "He's got reinforcements," and "They're in the trees," began to ripple through the white-robed ranks. Their discipline, which was thin to begin with, began to fray into a panicked, disorganized mess. By 4 a.m., the cohesive mob had dissolved into a collection of terrified individuals hiding behind whatever meager cover they could find in the fields. Paranoia, fed by the darkness and Eli's surgical precision, began to do the heavy lifting for him. In the gloom, every movement in the cotton rows was treated as a threat by the jittery attackers. Eli observed through his scope as a group of men near the creek bed began firing wildly toward the tree line, convinced that a secondary force was closing in. In reality, they were shooting at their own comrades who were trying to retreat for safety. "Stop shooting! It's us!" someone screamed, but the plea was lost in the rattle of undirected gunfire. Eli punctuated their panic with perfectly timed shots that kept them pinned, alternating his targets so that no one felt safe for more than a few seconds. He saw Reverend Matthews huddled behind a supply wagon, his hood torn and his divine authority completely evaporated. The man who had spoken so boldly of God's purpose was now whimpering in the dirt. This was the true nature of the mob. They were gods when the victim was defenseless, but they were brittle, frightened children when faced with actual resistance. Eli didn't need to fire 100 rounds to win. He only needed to fire the right ones at the right moments to ensure the mob's internal trust was completely incinerated. As the first grey tendrils of dawn began to lick the horizon, the true horror of the night was revealed to the clansmen. The ghost they were fighting was not an army, but the inevitable consequence of their own choices. Eli increased his tempo, his shots now finding flesh as the increasing light made his targets unmistakable. He aimed for limbs and shoulders, debilitating wounds that served a specific tactical purpose. A wounded man required 2 others to carry him, effectively removing 3 enemies from the field at once. He watched as a bullet from his Springfield caught Marcus Wheeler, the local bank manager, in the thigh. As Wheeler collapsed, his hood fell away, exposing his panicked, sweaty face to the very men he had conspired with. The realization that their identities were being stripped away by the rising sun acted like a physical blow to their morale. Some men began to strip off their robes in a frenzy, running openly toward the road and abandoning their weapons in a desperate bid to reach their trucks before the town saw who they really were. Sheriff Halverson tried to shout for a retreat, but his voice was thin, cracked, and ignored. Eli watched the rout through his sights, his finger steady and cold. He had survived the night, but the sun was about to shine a very bright, unforgiving light on the dark heart of the county. Daylight in the Delta is a harsh and uncompromising judge. As the sun crested the cypress trees, it illuminated a battlefield of red silt, spent brass, and discarded white rags. The remnants of the mob were no longer a terrifying force of nature. They were just a collection of middle-aged men in dirty laundry, stumbling through the very cotton they had hoped to steal. Eli stood by his window, his Springfield now resting at his side, its barrel hot, but its job finished. He didn't need to fire another shot. The psychological collapse of his enemies was complete. He watched through the scope as the men he had known for 15 years, the grocer, the mechanic, the lawman, crawled and limped away from his property like beaten dogs. They left behind a trail of abandoned rifles and blood-stained robes, evidence of a night they would spend the rest of their lives trying to lie about. The silence that followed the final echoes of gunfire was heavier than the noise had ever been. It was the silence of a system that had been broken from the inside out by a man they thought was too slow to think. Eli checked his watch. It was 6:30 a.m. He had held his ground and exposed the cowardice hidden beneath those hoods. But as the last of the trucks sped away in a cloud of red dust, he knew a new danger was arriving. The federal agents and the local cleanup crew. The victory of the night was short-lived, replaced by the mechanical, cold reality of state power. As the dust from the fleeing truck settled, a new cloud rose on the southern horizon, not the chaotic swirl of a retreating mob, but the synchronized advance of black federal sedans. The wail of sirens cut through the heavy morning air, a sharp, metallic sound that signaled the end of the combat and the beginning of the erasure. When the cars screeched to a halt in Eli's driveway, men in dark charcoal suits emerged with the clinical detachment of surgeons. These were the agents of the Federal Bureau, led by a man named Morris, whose eyes were as grey and uncompromising as the steel of a pistol. They didn't come with torches. They came with clipboards, cameras, and an immediate, overwhelming sense of authority. "Put the weapon on the porch, Mr. Mercer. Hands where we can see them," Morris commanded, his voice devoid of the local drawl, but heavy with the weight of the government. Eli complied with the same deliberate slowness he had used all his life, placing his Springfield down like a sacred relic. As two agents moved in to secure the rifle, others began to fan out across the property, planting small numbered flags next to the shell casings and the dark, rust-colored stains on the red silt. They didn't ask Eli if he was hurt. They didn't offer a word of comfort. To them, he was not a man who had defended his home. He was a variable in a high-stakes political equation they were already solving. The investigation was a masterclass in bureaucratic coldness. While Eli stood under armed guard, agents processed his property as if it were a laboratory. They found the 4 dead men in the fields, local pillars of the community whose white robes had been stripped away by their fleeing companions, leaving only their Sunday suits and the evidence of their failure. Sheriff Halverson claims a peaceful meeting was met with unprovoked military-grade gunfire, Agent Morris noted, his tone suggesting he didn't believe the lie but was required to document it nonetheless. He walked the perimeter of the house, his eyes lingering on the reinforced shutters and the tactical angles Eli had constructed. "This isn't the work of a frightened farmer," Morris observed, looking Eli directly in the eye. "This is a fortified position. You've got combat training that isn't in your local file, Mercer." Before Eli could respond, a commotion broke out at the rear of the house. 2 agents dragged Caleb Johnson from the root cellar, his hands zip-tied behind his back. The boy's eyes were wide with a terror that the night's gunfire hadn't been able to produce. "He's just a boy. He's a farmhand," Eli shouted, his voice cracking for the first time. Morris merely signaled for Caleb to be tossed into the back of a sedan. "Everyone's a witness until we decide they're a suspect," the agent replied, his focus already shifting to the road. The true betrayal arrived not in the form of a badge, but in the arrival of 3 rusted pickup trucks carrying men who had been in the tree line only hours before. Now, they weren't wearing hoods. They were wearing the overalls of the volunteer fire department and the badges of civilian deputies. They jumped from their trucks carrying heavy galvanized gas cans, their faces twisted with a predatory glee that the federal agents seemed to ignore. "We're here to contain the volatility, Agent Morris," one of the men, a cousin of Deputy Denton, announced. "Situation like this, with so much blood and unrest, the county fire marshal ordered a controlled burn to prevent further contagion in the community." Eli watched in horrified silence as the agent stepped back, allowing the men to begin dousing the edges of his 20-acre cotton empire with gasoline. The air, which had been sweet with the scent of morning dew, was suddenly choked by the sharp chemical stench of fuel. "This is my livelihood," Eli protested, stepping toward the field, only to have a federal rifle barrel leveled at his chest. Morris didn't look back as he checked his watch. "Active crime scene management, Mr. Mercer. Sometimes the only way to settle a county is to clear the board. You're lucky we aren't charging you with the deaths of 4 prominent citizens right now." The first match was struck with a casual flick, and the fire took hold with a roar that sounded like a physical scream. Within minutes, the 20 acres of prime Delta soil, the richest earth Eli had ever known, was transformed into a hellscape of orange and black. The cotton, which had been ready for harvest, burned with a white-hot intensity, sending thick plumes of oily smoke into the sky. Eli was forced to stand and watch as 15 years of labor, of independence, and of quiet dignity were reduced to drifting flakes of carbon. He saw the men with the gas cans laughing as they worked, their eyes reflecting the flames as they finished the job the mob couldn't complete the night before. This was the system's true power. It didn't need to kill a man if it could erase his world while he watched. From the window of the federal sedan, Caleb pressed his face against the glass, weeping as he saw the only place that had ever felt safe turn into an ash heap. The heat was so intense it blistered the paint on the side of Eli's house, but the agents didn't move. They stood like statues, witnessing the destruction of a black man's dream under the guise of public safety. The hunters had lost the battle of the night, but they were winning the war of the day, using the very law Eli had hoped would protect him to finalize his ruin. As the sun reached its zenith, the fire began to die down, leaving behind a black, smoldering wasteland where his future had once grown. The fire department packed their cans and left with mocking waves, their mission accomplished. Agent Morris finally turned to Eli, his expression unchanged by the tragedy he had just sanctioned. "Pack a bag, Mercer. You're coming to town for questioning, and if I were you, I'd think very carefully about the story you tell." They didn't let him walk. They threw him into the back of a car like a common criminal, his boots treading on the very ash of his own life. As the sedans pulled away from the ranch, Eli looked back one last time. The house still stood, but it was an island in a sea of charcoal. The deadliest shooter in the South had defended his life, but the cost of that defense was the total annihilation of his peace. The silence of the Delta was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of a grave. As they drove toward the county jail, Eli didn't beg, and he didn't cry. He sat in the darkness of the back seat, his mind already shifting from the tactics of the rifle to the tactics of the record, remembering the one thing they had forgotten to burn: the truth hidden in a wooden box in a friend's attic. The iron gates of the county jail groaned with a finality that seemed to echo across the silent town square. Eli emerged into the harsh, late afternoon light of the Delta, his clothes still reeking of the gasoline and scorched cotton that had defined his morning. His release hadn't been an act of mercy, but a calculated expulsion. Agent Morris had stood over his desk, not looking up as he delivered the ultimatum. Eli had until the sun touched the horizon to cross the county line, or the active investigation would pivot back toward his own role in the deaths of the town's prominent citizens. As he stood on the sidewalk, the townsfolk moved around him like water around a stone, their eyes averted in a practiced communal blindness. Some of these men had been in the tree line, others had cheered as his fields burned. Now they all shared the same terrified silence of men who had seen a ghost and realized it could strike back. A battered black Ford pulled up to the curb, and Lillian Johnson, Caleb's mother, stepped out. Her face was a mask of grief and determination. "They're holding Caleb until you're gone," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She opened the trunk to reveal a weathered wooden box marked with the faded insignia of the 92nd Infantry Division. "I found this in the attic of the Thompson estate while I was cleaning. Marcus Thompson wanted you to have it if the night ever came that the law failed you. He was the only one who remembered the truth of what you did in France." Eli took the box with hands that were finally beginning to feel the weight of the last 24 hours. Inside, protected from the damp Delta air by layers of waxed cloth, lay the architectural plans of a different kind of war. There were original training manifests from Camp Shelby, marksmanship scores that hadn't been adjusted by the War Department, and personal letters from officers whose lives Eli had saved in the Argonne. Most importantly, there was a ledger kept by Marcus Thompson, the former regimental quartermaster, detailing the systematic efforts by local officials to erase the military records of black veterans. It was a map of corruption that named names: Halverson, Denton, Matthews, linking their current positions of power to a decades-long conspiracy of theft and intimidation. "They tried to burn your future today, Eli," Lillian said softly as they drove toward the county line, the sunset painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fire. "But they forgot that paper holds memory longer than soil does. You can't kill the truth with a match." As the car crossed the bridge into Memphis, Eli looked back one last time at the darkness of the Delta. He was a man without land, without a home, and without a harvest. But in his lap sat a box that contained the power to dismantle the very system that had tried to bury him. The deadliest marksman in the South was done with the rifle. He was ready for the record. Chicago in the winter was a landscape of gray steel and biting wind, a world away from the humid lethargy of Mississippi. Eli found work as a mechanic in a small garage on the south side, his large, precise hands becoming legendary for their ability to soothe a dying engine. He lived a quiet, monastic life in a small apartment filled with books and the steady ticking of a grandfather clock. But beneath the surface of his unremarkable existence, a slow-motion ambush was unfolding. He spent his nights working with a group of northern journalists and civil rights lawyers, systematically feeding them the contents of Marcus Thompson's box. One by one, the prominent citizens of the Delta began to fall, not to bullets, but to subpoenas and front-page exposés. Sheriff Halverson was the first to resign, cited for health reasons, just as a federal audit of his property seizures was announced. Deputy Denton vanished into the night, fleeing a racketeering charge that had its roots in the burning of Eli's fields. Reverend Matthew's church was shuttered by his own denomination after his ties to the 1938 siege were documented in a nationally syndicated series of articles. The system that had protected them for decades proved to be as brittle as sun-dried cotton when faced with the cold, unyielding pressure of documented truth. Eli watched the dominoes fall from a distance, feeling no joy, only the grim satisfaction of a mission finally completed. 5 years after the fire, Eli stood in the center of a converted warehouse that now housed the Veterans Marksmanship Association. He had founded the center not to train soldiers, but to teach mastery of self to a new generation of black men who had returned from a different war. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic, controlled breathing of 12 students lined up at the firing blocks. Eli moved behind them, his limp still present, but no longer a performance. He stopped behind a young man named James, whose hands were shaking as he struggled to find his sight picture. "The rifle is just a mirror, son," Eli said, his voice a low, resonant hum that calmed the air around him. "If you're angry, the rifle is angry. If you're afraid, the rifle is afraid. You have to find the stillness inside yourself before you can ever hope to find the center of that target. Mastery isn't about the power to destroy. It's about the discipline to remain standing when everyone else is running." He watched as James took a long, slow breath, his shoulders dropping and his hands steadying. The shot that followed was a perfect, quiet punctuation of control. This was Eli's true legacy, not the night he fought 100 men, but the years he spent teaching others how to hold their ground without losing their souls. He had survived the erasure, and in doing so, he had ensured that no one else would have to disappear into the shadows of history. As the final session of the day concluded, the veterans gathered their gear with the quiet, dignified discipline that Eli had made his hallmark. They spoke in hushed tones, showing a level of respect for themselves and each other that the world outside often denied them. James approached Eli as he was locking the equipment cabinet, looking at the old man with a mixture of curiosity and reverence. "Mr. Mercer, they say you were the best there ever was. Do you ever miss the ranch? Do you ever miss the land?" Eli looked out the high window at the Chicago skyline, the lights flickering on like distant stars against the twilight. "The land is just dirt, James. It can be bought, it can be sold, and it can be burned. But what we built here and what we carry in our minds, that's the only thing they can't take away from us." He stepped out into the cold night air, his massive frame a silhouette of quiet strength. Behind him, the legacy of Big Eli lived on in the steady hands of the men he had trained. "I hope you found this journey of resilience and justice as powerful as I did." This was the story of a man who refused to be erased. Make sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of history we uncover together. Tomorrow's story is one that has been buried for nearly a century, and you'll want to be here when we bring it to the light.